non-resident scholar with the New Lines Institute coordinating their Universal Value and Good Governance initiative. He has his PhD in International Relations from Georgetown University, an MA in International Relations from Florida International University, an MBA from Bombay University, and a BE from Osmania University. I'm sorry. He is the author of the award-winning book Islam and Good Governance, Political Philosophy of Ihsan. His latest ebook is The Rise of India as a World Power. Over to Dr. Khan.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're able to hear me. So thank you for inviting me to give this invited lecture. I am deeply honored. I want to thank the Executive Committee of the West Bengal Political Science Association, the President, Mr. Chattopadhyay, the Vice Presidents, Mitra, Roy, Basu, Sen, and Naskar, and also the General Secretary who has been communicating with me, Mr. Muqtedar. I like small regional political science associations because I feel that they allow for more sustained networking. So you get to know your colleagues who are geographically closer to you. You can do joint projects. They're also very useful for socializing graduate students and for inter-university cooperation. So my presentation titled India and the Globalized World, Does India Have a Grand Strategy? Essentially has four questions. My first question is, what is grand strategy? So please indulge me to share with you because I have a slightly different conception of what is a grand strategy from the standard definition advanced, especially by the Yale University's grand strategy group like Charlie Hill or Rich Gaddis. My second part of the presentation is basically what's happening in the international system, what is happening to globalization, and what is happening to the global balance of power. Basically, a discussion of the changes in the international system, something in India they love to use the word churning, the churning that is going on in the international system. My third part of my presentation is how are international and domestic factors shaping India's foreign policy? What is India's grand strategy? And basically how India is going around trying to achieve this grand strategy. So moving to the first part as to what is a grand strategy. This is the generally broad definition that people use it, even though people who are in the defense establishment in the United States at least focus a lot on the form of the implications that it has for military strategies. Whereas those who are in the foreign policy side of it, really focus more on the statecraft of the foreign policy. So you could say that it is the highest form of statecraft, where basically you are trying to use all sources of national power, whether it's economic power, military power, and diplomatic power, to develop a strategies to secure a nation's national security. So, for example, you can see the United States sending diplomats all the time out there, pressuring countries to align their interests with the United States to help the United States achieve its goals. You see, we have bases all over the world. We are always at war with somebody or the other. So you can see the deployment of military power. And now we are sanctioning everybody and their uncle. So you can see the use of economic power, military power, and diplomatic power pressed into the service of national interest, especially the national security side of that. So that is generally understood as what is grand strategy. I add a little bit more to it. I believe that a grand strategy is more than just securing national security. It also entails a nation becoming and realizing a vision that it may have for itself. So, for example, I also contend that this is a constructivist way of thinking about grand strategy. Usually, grand strategies, at least in the US context, are advanced either by liberal internationalists who talk about selective engagement or enlargement of democracy or expansion of free societies, promotion of democracy. These are the guiding principles or grand strategies for liberal internationalists. But for those who are from the realist side, they talk about either global domination or isolationism or offshore balancing. These are some of the grand strategies that the realists talk about. But as a constructivist, I believe that a grand strategy is not just about securing national security, but it is also about securing national identity and national culture. And therefore, especially countries like India, which are not just nation states, but also civilizations in themselves, there is a constructivist component to achieving. So countries have these long-term vision of not only securing their national security, but also securing their place in the international system, and also to promote their culture worldwide. So in India's case, the grand strategy's goal would be either to become a great Hindu nation and let the world appreciate Hindu culture, or what is defined as Indian culture, if you want to be more inclusive, basically fulfilling what Pandit Nehru called a tryst with destiny. So he was able to imagine that India has had a destiny, and all strategies and all resources that are being employed to achieve that destiny, which is not just becoming a world power, but which is also about becoming a certain kind of world power. India aspires not just to become a major world power, but a different kind of world power. So different words are tossed around, which essentially, whether the users of those words understand it or not, but it is clearly an indication that there is a grand strategy. So, for example, the term Vishwa Guru, which is tossed around by Prime Minister Modi himself. I have never really heard Dr. Jaishankar use it, but others have used the word. So it suggests very clearly that India wants to become a certain kind of power, world power. The United States, when the liberals are in power, is interested in becoming the champion of freedom and democracy and human rights. And so it is more than just securing national security understood in material terms, but is also securing national security plus certain normative values. So for me, a grand strategy is about both material security as well as achieving an ideational component, whether it is values or perception, whether you want the world to think of you in a certain way. And so you can imagine a lot of you will have to accumulate a lot of soft power and deploy a lot of economic resources to make people like you or think of you. So, for example, if you want to be the nicest and the friendliest person in your department, if you want to project yourself as that, well, you'll have to throw a lot of parties and they cost. So that is how I see grand strategy. It is beyond, and therefore, because it has such an expansive idea, for those who think of grand strategy in merely power terms, are actually also thinking of shaping the international system in such a way that it becomes protective of your national security and also something that advances and advocates for your international interests. So if you are thinking of grand strategy in the way that I am talking about it, so it not only entails impacting the structure of global politics in terms of distribution of power, but it is also shaping the perceptions of the world in that sense. So that is an important part of it. And I think India is playing that game. So, for example, the use of Yoga Day internationally is a way to promote. Some might say that it is a promotion of India's identity as a Hindu state in a very soft way, but yoga has been so broadly appropriated culturally by many, many countries that they do not necessarily connect that to the Hindutva project. So, but it is also promoting Indian culture in that sense. So you can see the state definitely doing certain things which are grand strategic in nature, with perception, which involves changing world's perception of who you are. So my second part of my presentation is the changes in the global structure. So in the presentation, as we said, we're talking about India in a globalized world. Does it have a grand strategy? So the reason why I'm talking about grand strategy and the reason why more and more people are talking about grand strategy is because the discussion on grand strategy becomes salient only when the international system is not stable. When the international system is stable and the distribution of power is stable, so you know where you are. So your strategy, if you are not number one, is to basically try to revise the system if you can. So either you can change the system by opposing the system like China and Russia are trying to do, or you can try to reform the system from within by playing according to the rules, not resisting the system, but constantly demanding a change in the system, like India is trying to do, especially with regards to global multilateral governance. So India does not challenge the UN, but constantly says the UN would be more effective if the UN Security Council would be reformed and India gets a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So if you're not number one, then you're always trying to bring about change. But if you are number one, then you are promoting status quo and you want more change. But when the system is unstable, as it is at the moment, then it is an opportunity for other actors to try and shape the system in such a way that it benefits their interests. So right now, especially in the past few years, you could take 2020 as a cutoff point. There's certain things, the greater impact of climate change, pandemics like COVID and its disruptive impact on the global economy and geopolitics, and the return of traditional great power rivalry with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the potential for China's uh, 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 belligerent actions against Taiwan. So, as you see the return of traditional geopolitics, we are we can at least conclude that the system is not as stable as it was, say, 10 years ago, where the United States was enjoying a unipolar moment and more or less dictated what happened. So the rule based order was basically the United States' whims and fancies. And we kind of used the system and the absence of a great power rival to try and shape the system. And that's why globalization sort of reached the peak in the first 5 to 10 years, in spite of the economic crisis that we were beginning to experience. But now, because the system is in flux, and primarily because the relative balance of power between the United States and its competitors is reducing the ability of the United States to essentially impose its will on the rest of the world. I mean, Iran has been resisting the United States for 40 years. China is continuing to do that even more so. Russia obviously has gone to war, and even non-state actors like Hamas and the Houthis are not really overly impressed by Western military capabilities and power and are willing to challenge that. So we have a system where there's constant challenge to the global order. And so in this uh, environment, it becomes very important for countries to be able to see and say, look, we are entering a tunnel, and at the end of the tunnel, the world is going to be different. So grand strategy would be to say, okay, how is the world going to look at the end of the tunnel? When we come out of this tunnel, what is going to be the distribution of power? What is going to be the rules by which we will conduct international trade? And so you build a strategy to maximize your own advantage in that new world that is going to emerge. So that's why we are living in an era where more and more countries should be thinking and rethinking their grand strategies. Some of the changes, key changes that have taken place in the world is with regards to globalization is that I think globalization as understood during the heydays of globalization are no more valid. So people are talking about deglobalization or reglobalization. Dr. Jaishankar likes to call it as rebalancing. And the word that is constantly thrown around is that we are now clearly moving away from the unipolar world of US hegemony into a multipolar world. I don't think that we are in a multipolar world yet. However, we must recognize that the constant use of the term multipolar world, whether it is France, whether it's China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, what the multipolar world is essentially a profound desire and intense desire by the rest of the world to live in a world which is not dominated by the United States. So multipolarity today is essentially a code. So when a country says we are living in a multipolar world, what you should understand is that the country is saying, I wish I could live in a world where the United States is not a dominant power. So that's what they're trying to say. So that is an important part. And you can recognize that there is still tremendous power available to the United States, especially through its allies in Europe, the G7, as well as the European Union and NATO. Through the conference that was hosted in Switzerland for Ukraine, I mean, that was a totally useless exercise. But what it did show that there were at least 90 countries who were willing to respond or felt the need to respond to the call by Western powers to come all the way to Switzerland. Some didn't vote, mostly from the BRICS side of the world, but there were 78 countries who signed up to a meaningless document. And that is still reflection that we are not living in a multipolar world. In a multipolar world, something like that would not have happened. Some of the fundamental changes that have happened in the economic arena is basically the shifting away from what we used to have offshoring to now what we call as friendshoring. So more and more countries disturbed either by the disruption of supply chains during the pandemic or having suffered the consequences of inflation in their economies as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of the supply of grain and food for a major part of the global south. So suddenly countries have realized that the weakening of the international system is causing both geopolitical upheavals, which are disrupting the chain. So they are willing to spend a little bit more for a more guaranteed and safe supply chain. So either you are interested in nearshoring, which means the United States feels that, oh my God, we could have a global supply chain disrupted if I go all the way to Vietnam. But if I start investing in Canada and Mexico, they are nearby and it reduces cost of transportation if other things are expensive. Or they might go to friendshoring and say, look, I don't want to invest more in China because China is geopolitically hostile and is challenging my status as the world's preeminent power. So I will go and invest in a friendly country like India, where India is not going to challenge me. So either this nearshoring or friendshoring is restructuring the global economy. And therefore, you can see that even the West, to some extent, is a bit confused on how to deal with essentially the challenge. The primary reason why we are seeing a structural shift and the potential shift from unipolarity to multipolarity is because of the rise of China. And not just rise of China, but rise of an aggressive and hostile China. So China's rapidly growing economy and its share of the global GDP is definitely challenging the West. More than 10 years ago, the US realized that Europe was not the most important part. Asia was, primarily because of China. And so Obama went to pivot to Asia. But the second part is that even India is rising, and India has become now the 5th biggest economy. And inshallah, in less than 2 or 3 years, India, by 2028 or 2030, will be the 3rd biggest economy. And then that top 3 will remain stable for probably 50 to 100 years unless there's something very drastic and unanticipatable happens, that we cannot anticipate what is going to happen. But otherwise, you will have a more stable distribution of economic power, but it is only after the United States, after India overtakes Japan and Germany. And then you also realize that China now has a bigger air force, a bigger army, and a bigger navy than the United States. We know that it is quantitatively powerful. There are questions that some people raise about the quality of Chinese military power. But the fact that it has that kind of power is the reason why we are seeing this shift. So in this whole system where sometimes it appears as if the world is being divided into the West versus the rest, my president, Mr. Biden, in his rare moments of clarity, tries to say that, oh, the world is being divided into a democratic side of the world and autocratic side of the world, which I completely disagree with because increasingly democracies are declining even in the so-called democratic side of the world. The US, according to the democracy index, is not even a full democracy anymore. Not only that, with the rise of right-wing parties and authoritarian and neo-fascist parties in Europe, it would be a stretch to call the Western G7, NATO, and European Union conglomerate as a force for democracy. And given how they are conducting the war in the Middle East, clearly democracy, human rights are not relevant to this bloc. They are actively perpetrating a genocide, even as we watch. The world is currently witnessing a genocide in Gaza, and so the rule-based order and preference for democracy, etc., become laughable concepts. So in this system, as the world is shifting away from globalization to a new form of global economy, for those of you who are interested in this international political economic side of it, Geeta Gopinath gave a very interesting lecture at Stanford University. She's the #2 in IMF and is of Indian origin. She gave a very good lecture about what is happening to international trade as a result of the global geopolitics. And she argued that what is happening is a fragmentation of the global economy. And as a result of the fragmentation, we don't have one global economy, which is the central principle of globalization, that we live in one global economy. But what she's saying is that now you can see blocks. So there's a Chinese economic bloc, there's a global South economic bloc, and there is the Western or liberal democratic economic bloc. And as a result of this fragmentation, she says the extent of the fragmentation will determine to what extent there will be a decline in the global GDP. So she anticipates either a 0.5% decline in the global GDP, which would be very highly impactful in terms of undermining the global South. But it could also lead to about 7% decline in international trade and global GDP. And that would be very, very devastating, especially to developing countries, because that could even arrest the growth that many countries have shown in the past few years. So this shift, this potential shift from unipolarity to multipolarity is not necessarily advantageous to all countries. Some countries may get more power than they previously had. One of them is potentially India. But other countries may actually suffer as a result of the multipolar world. So in this transition, I want to ask the question, does India have a grand strategy? If you talk to Indian experts, foreign policy experts, the most common term that pops up is strategic autonomy. This has been the enduring principle of Indian foreign policy all the way from Nehru to Prime Minister Modi today. What India values most is strategic autonomy because it is part of your sovereignty. So if you do not have strategic autonomy, it implies that you do not really are a sovereign state. So if you are a sovereign state, you should be able to pursue your national interests without foreign interference or pressure that modifies the way you conduct yourself in the international system. But the manner in which India, so if you look at the early part of Indian foreign policy history, the strategic autonomy translated into what was called the non-aligned movement. And so the global structure of bipolarity, the communist part and the capitalist part, essentially dictated how non-alignment was. So I call that as pursuit of purity. So we are neither with the communists, and we are not with the capitalists. We are not with the Warsaw Pact. We are not with NATO. So non-alignment in the earlier part meant not aligning with anybody. But the current posture of strategic autonomy by Prime Minister Modi particularly is that it is very different. We have moved away from purity to promiscuity. In the past, we said, look, we're not going to marry anybody. We're not going to marry NATO. We're not going to marry the Warsaw Pact. But now Modi says, look, I'm not going to marry anybody, but I will date everybody. So on Saturday, I will go out with Russia. On Sunday, I will go out to the farm that the United States owns. So India is now ready to date with everybody as long as India benefits from it in some way. So even though India is maintaining the same broad, grand strategic goal of remaining autonomous from a strategic point of view, but it's the manner in which that autonomy is defined is very different. So India is willing to play ball with everybody. Now, that is theoretically the idea, but if you actually look at the ground realities during the entire Cold War period, even though the United States, even though India claimed to be fully non-aligned, you could see that India was not entirely non-aligned. It was very clearly a better friend of the Soviet Union, much more aligned with the Soviet Union. And so its military power and military capabilities were hugely dependent on the supply chain from the communist world, especially the Soviet Union. And that dependence continues to this day, that even 50% of India's military resources are still coming from Russia, at least. So in that sense, you could say that while India may have enjoyed diplomatic autonomy, it did not really achieve strategic and military autonomy because of its dependence on the Soviet Union. Now, what is happening now in this new transition is, while India desires a multipolar world, somebody asked Dr. Jaishankar as to whether you will be becoming part of the Western camp. He said, I don't want to be part of the American camp or the Chinese camp. I want to have a camp of my own. That sounds very good. It's a pretty good sound bites, and it can go on Twitter, and it drives the unbucks like they get delirious and orgasmic on these statements. But what you really see is that the United States, India is trading a dependence on Russia to a new engagement with the West, which will ultimately result in India's dependence on Western military capabilities. So, for example, India has been struggling to come up with a jet engine to have an indigenous fighter plane, and now we went and got the jet engine of an F-18 that Tom Cruise was flying in the Top Gun movie in the 1980s. I was in high school, I think, when I saw that movie. That is the engine that India has bought, and it will take 10 more years for it to have that engine in indigenously manufactured jet fighters. And that would mean that India is now once again dependent not on Russia, but on the United States for more and more advanced military technology. So there are limits to the autonomy that India can enjoy in this grand strategy. And I am willing to bet that in Prime Minister Modi's third term, unless India's transnational repression, that is what the Americans call India's attempt to kill Khalistani dissidents all over the world, if India tries to do that again in a Western country, like a G7 country or a Five Eyes country, then that could really derail relations with the US. But if India does not pull another stunt like that again, at least in Western countries, then I can I can bet that India will be more in the American camp by the end of Modi's third term than it was at this moment, which means that even before the structure of the system ends its turmoil and becomes more stable, India would have undermined its strategic autonomy and become part of more or less the G7. So G7 will become G8, and India will be part of that. And the cost of that would be India's membership in BRICS, as well as India's desire to become the leader of the global south. So I'm going to move now to the final section of my presentation, which is to look at some specific aspects of how this grand strategy of India is really translating. There is a lot of talk in India about the rise of India and the rising stature of India. What has happened is that the world has recognized the potential of India as a major power, and are pampering and reaching out to the potential of India. And that is being confused. And let me put it very clearly, the overtures of other countries or the foreign policies of other countries is being understood as success of Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy. I'm not fully persuaded that that is the case. So let me go down a few examples to show you why I think so. So, for example, if you look at India's neighborhood policy, immediate neighborhood, and then the distant neighborhood, which is South Asia, then Central Asia, then the rest of the world. So, if you these are the three circles in which India wishes to think of its foreign policy. So, India wants a neighborhood policy which is safe. But if you look at the neighborhood, there are India is one of the few countries which has two nuclear powers as its neighbors, and it does not have good relations with either of them. Even though China is once again India's biggest trading partner, it has overtaken the United States. It's primarily a source country for India. It exports to India. And so India does not have good relations with Pakistan. India does not have good relations with China. And in the last 10 years or last 5 years, whichever way you want to look, India has not improved its relations with either of these two most critical neighbors. So you could clearly say that that is a failure of the neighborhood first policy. Look at what is happening in Maldives, what is happening in Nepal. In Bangladesh now, people are also raising the slogan "India out." So the only success that the Indian government likes to cite about is India's economic help to Sri Lanka at a time when China was unwilling to help Sri Lanka. And so we assume that our foreign policy has been successful in Sri Lanka because the Sri Lankans are very grateful to India. So you have to be a really diehard nationalist and a blind follower of Prime Minister Modi in any way to give him a passing grade on the neighborhood policy. I feel that the soft Hindutva that he's pushing in his foreign policy is creating a lot of resentment in. To put it very bluntly, if you look at the map of Akhand Bharat, there are 4 Muslim majority countries in Akhand Bharat: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Maldives. And India has good relations with only one of them at the moment, which is Afghanistan, and we don't even recognize their government. So this soft Hindutva policy will have a counterproductive impact on the neighborhood first policy. If you want to be successful in your neighborhood, then you will have to be appreciative and be able to recognize the impact of Islam in South Asia over the past few hundred years. And from a military doctrine, the Indian generals talk about either 2 front wars or 2.5 front wars. The half front is essentially military insurgency. Some people say the half front is all the Muslims in India, but the military generals usually think of it as insurgency. And if you look at the rise of terrorism or return of terrorism in the Kashmir region, and especially in Jammu, you can clearly argue that the 2.5 fronts are not at peace. Yes, the ceasefire with Pakistan is holding, but the relations with Pakistan are not stable. So in that sense, both from a military and a diplomatic perspective, I think the neighborhood first policy is not working. From a strategic point of view, I've already made the argument that India desperately seeking free trade agreements with Europe, with England, with the countries which are not part of the European Common Market, and seeking much more closer ties, military, cultural, and economic ties with the US, especially through Quad. All of these are going to be constraints on India's autonomy. So, in that sense, India's strategic autonomy will, in the long run, be undermined significantly by the unilateral institutions like the Quad that it is becoming a part of. I also want to touch very briefly upon this issue that India sees itself as a leader of the global South. It's like running with the hare and hunting with the hound. You want to be the leader of the global South, but you also want to be part of Global 7. It is like saying that you're campaigning to be the president of the labor union, and all you do in your free time is go to parties held by industrialists. So you're hanging out with this industrialist, that industrialist, you're going to the parties hosted by the capitalists while you are campaigning to be the leader of the labor union party. So you can see all these photographs of Prime Minister Modi hanging around with the Prime Minister of Italy, or going to Australia, or going to other parts of the Western countries, and which are hugely celebrated in India as achievements. But that does not increase India's leadership of the global south. And let me give you one example that shows there is nothing more south than Gaza in the global south. Gaza is the symbol of the global south, a colonized territory of the global south by the global north, is under severe attack, is facing a genocidal war of revenge. Yes, what Hamas did was horrible and inhuman on October 7th, but the response has been so profoundly disproportionate, it is unthinkable. Yet India has done nothing to stand up for the most global south of the global south. You see South Africa taking a leadership position on this Gaza issue. If India was the leader of the global south, India should have been leading the charge against Israeli atrocities in Gaza. But it is left it to someone else to take the leadership position. Even when India abstained from signing the declaration in Switzerland on the Ukraine issue, the reasons given by India, Saudi Arabia, and UAE was the absence of Russia, but South Africa essentially said the presence of Israel was the reason why South Africa did not sign that document. On the other hand, if you look at investments, etc., China is far ahead of both the United States as well as India or even France in investments in Africa. And nearly every country of the global south is now part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So from that point of view, it's very difficult to claim that India has won the leadership contest for the global south. I sometimes say, out of my love for my former country, that China is the banker of the global south, while India is the ambassador of the global south, because India speaks for the interests of the global south and brought Africa into the G20. So in that sense, I think that while India does have a grand strategy, which is to try and benefit from everybody by trying to have good relations with everybody. So basically, we will date everybody, we will not marry anyone, is essentially how I summarize India's grand strategy. But when the specific execution part comes forward, then it does not work really well in this area. Where India has been successful is in the geo-economic arena, where India is now potentially seen as an alternative to China for investments, as a trade partner. And the fact that India's economy is growing and creating a large, perhaps the largest middle class in the world, which will remain very attractive to the rest of the world. And so more and more countries will continue to look up to India, look at India for opportunities for investment, trade, and of course, India is becoming the supplier of talent globally. So in those sense, from a geo-economic perspective, India is rising very fast. But from a geopolitical perspective, I think there are lots of question marks about the success of Indian foreign policy. And perhaps I think India's grand strategy is also being compromised as a result of the changing global order. So I'm going to stop with that, and I will be happy to take your questions if there are any.